to thank the sponsors, PropTech and Asia CEO, and the much longer list that Emma went through. I don't want to repeat and cut into my time. Oops, I'm already ahead of where I'm supposed to be. To get to the basic dilemma we're facing, the world needs to get to net zero emissions, meaning zero emissions effectively by 2050, roughly. That's what the agreement negotiated in Paris to keep the global temperature below 2 degrees and hopefully below 1.5 degrees requires that with some uncertainty, essentially it has to be net zero emissions by 2050. So that's good enough for us to work with. Yes, so the bad news is we've already gotten 1.1 degrees, so we're more than halfway to where we don't want to go past. And that temperature is still rising. So all of the impacts that are occurring, we will get worse even if we meet the target of 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we are in a situation where things are not good, and if we want to stop that, it has to be net zero. And to get to net zero, we have to start reducing globally emissions very soon, immediately. In addition to this global requirement to get to net zero, over 130 individual countries have set national targets to get to net zero, and there are several hundred corporations and a few thousand provinces, states, and cities that also have net zero commitments. So those commitments are becoming increasingly widespread. I could not find that the Philippines has such a commitment at the moment, so something to think about for the Philippines. But you have a new government coming in a few days that might do something about that. So, getting to net zero. This is a global picture from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The top red lines are what would happen if we continue with our current emissions. The bottom lines are lines that will get us to net zero by 2050. If you look very closely, there's a pointer here somewhere. No, I can't get it. Anyway, it is so difficult to get to net zero that the science and the models of the science suggest that we can't do it, and that we will need to make up the difference through various forms of sequestration, tree planting and so forth that you've heard of, and even capturing carbon dioxide from the air and putting it into unused oil wells, gas wells, and so forth, sequestering it in the ground for thousands of years. So, as I said, the impacts of climate change are very numerous, and as was just mentioned, Philippines is ranked as the 4th most vulnerable country in the world to these impacts, and the bad news is they're going to get worse. There is some opportunity for adaptation to some of these impacts. You can build seawalls, you can deal with urban infrastructure to carry off the rain from heavy rainfalls. There are ways of extending the habitats, ecosystems of various plants and wildlife, but effectively the options are limited, and as the temperature goes up, the impacts get worse, and your ability to adapt to them is reduced. Once an island in the Maldives disappears, it disappears. Once an animal is extinct or an ecosystem is extinct, it's extinct. It's not coming back through adaptation. So adaptation is necessary, but it's not a solution. The solution is that we have to get to net zero. Let me touch on the situation in the Philippines, and you've heard this before. Philippines total emissions are less than 0.5% of the global emissions, and on a per capita basis, they're well under half of the global average per capita emissions. And that's true. But it's also true for another 120 developing countries. So the Philippines is not unique in that respect, and many of the other 120 are even in a situation where their contribution is even smaller on a total or per capita basis. But being small doesn't mean you get a free pass. To get to net zero globally, everybody has to get to net zero. You can't have net zero for every country except the Philippines, and the Philippines gets to emit. That's not going to deal with the climate issue. So the Paris Agreement has provisions where developing countries submit nationally determined contributions of things that they will do on their own to reduce emissions, and additional actions that they will take if they have international support. And the Philippines has submitted such a contribution, and it was referenced before. And the unconditional actions that the Philippines will take are a couple of percentage reductions and a much larger reduction if they get international financial support. The problem with that for the Philippines and all developing countries is that the developed countries have promised funding of $100 billion US per year to support these activities in developing countries. But they've never delivered on that. And my sense is they never will deliver on that. So don't hold your breath waiting for the check to come from Canada or the other developing countries. I'm sorry to say. That's the reality of the world. The world is unfair. I think despite that, there are things that can and will happen in the Philippines to reduce their emissions, and I'll talk about those a little bit. So first, what does the GHG emissions of the Philippines look like? You see a couple of big bars. The biggest one is energy. Basically, generation of electricity is 35% of the emissions in the Philippines. Agriculture is about 1/4 of the emissions. Rice farming, animals are the major contributors to that. Around the world, about 20 or 25% of the emissions are from agriculture, so Philippines is not so unique in that respect. Then you have industry and transport, each about 15%. Buildings down around 5%. And so you're the good news in this picture, and you're doing your part, but you can do more. Yes, so if you look at that picture, what is a reasonable strategy for the Philippines to adopt? In any country, any business, what you've heard several times today, the basic strategy is to improve energy efficiency and then to convert from fossil fuels to electricity where it's possible, and then you put the onus on the utilities to switch to renewable sources of energy. So that's the basic strategy, and it covers probably 80 or 85% of the emissions because they're all energy related. Now, to get back to the specific situation in the Philippines, I would think you want to focus on the sectors where the actions today will affect the emissions in 2050. And those sectors are the electricity generation, because the power stations have a long life, and the building sector, because buildings, even the shoddy ones that were talked about, have a 30-year life, and the good ones have a 100-year life. but all of them are going to be around in 2050. So if you start working on the sectors where the impacts are going to last a long time, that will make the job easier. And when you get to other sectors where the infrastructure and the decisions can be made more quickly, you can postpone some action on that. The second aspect of that reinforces that strategy is, and this is a graph from the Intergovernmental Climate Change Report from earlier this year. The blue bars are the low-cost emission reduction options. And you'll see big blue bars for electricity generation, which is solar, wind, and geothermal, and some smaller blue bars for the building sector, where you can improve the envelope, use LED lighting, efficient appliances, and so forth, all very cost-effective options. And the third one is for the transport sector, where the low-cost options are essentially fuel switching as opposed to the electric vehicles, but those are becoming more competitive as well. So what about the other sectors that are large emitters, and why do I give them lower priority? For the agriculture sector, it's a very complex sector. There are numerous sources of emissions, from rice growing to animals to fertilizer use, water use, and so forth. So they all require a wide range of different solutions. In many cases, we haven't found solutions yet to get to net zero. But those are issues around the world, and people around the world are working on them. And the other aspect of it is that the adjustments can usually happen very quickly. That if there's a new variety of rice, you plant that variety next year, so you don't need 30 years to change over your agriculture technology. For animals, you might need 5 years or so to change over your livestock. But it's a short-term adjustment problem once the solutions are found. The same sort of thing with industries in the Philippines. The share in any given industry in the Philippines, steel, cement, whatever, is a small share of the global production. The developed countries are trying to find solutions, developed countries and China. China is very active in these areas, trying to find solutions that are net zero. When those become available, they can be adopted in the Philippines. You don't have to reinvent every industry in the Philippines. And the last one is transportation, where every vehicle manufacturer, basically except Russia, I think, is committed to producing only electric vehicles by 2030 or 2035. What does that mean? When you buy a car in the Philippines after 2030, it's going to be electric. You will not have a choice unless you buy from Russia, and you probably don't want to buy from Russia. So and those cars that you buy starting in 2030 will be around the cars that will be around in 2050. So whether you do something aggressive to promote electric cars, my guess is that all the cars in the Philippines in 2050 will be electric cars. It just won't be too many options on that. So let's get to the sectors where you need to do stuff now. This is the emissions from electricity generation in the Philippines. The bottom bar is coal use, emissions from coal. The gray is emissions from natural gas. So you see that they have been increasing dramatically as electricity consumption has been increasing in the Philippines. This goes from 1990 to about 2018, and it's all driven by coal and natural gas. The options are available, and I think in recent years, solar and wind and geothermal and hydro are all less costly than coal, and the challenge is to phase out coal production first, and then natural gas will come along a little later because it will also be more expensive. And my understanding is that there was a commitment to phase out coal-fired generation by 2040. There are other countries that are trying to accelerate that, and the action needs to start happening soon. There are certainly some indications that it's starting to happen on the grid scale and in the distribution scale by putting it on houses and other buildings. So that's the big challenge because it's 35% of the emissions. It's sensible because the alternatives, the renewable alternatives, are cheap and reliable, and they can be implemented quickly. So buildings and housing and the people involved with PropTech, as I said, the houses built today, regardless of quality, almost will be around in 2050, so do a good job today to get you to that solution. There are, as you know better than me, designs for zero energy buildings. Look into them, start building them, focus on the building shell, on the windows, the lighting systems, the appliances or HVAC systems, and where possible, draw on renewable local supplies. So geothermal and heat pumps, where ground source heat pumps or water source heat pumps if you have that option in your development, and obviously solar, which is a number of developments have been highlighted today. As was mentioned earlier, the sustainable design and building is important because that phase of the development represents a quarter of the life cycle emissions for a building. The remaining 75% happen while the building's being used, but a quarter is a significant share of the emissions, and you want to start reducing that share. I'm sure as developers and builders, you're well aware of the issue that you have cost pressures to build your buildings and make them attractive both in price and features for your customers, and the customers don't necessarily know the consequences in terms of their operating costs and energy use from that. So there's this disconnect of how do you design and build quality buildings and then get that message across to the customers. And I think the solution that has again been alluded to by a number of speakers is the certification processes, so that the LEED standards and other standards for environmentally sustainable buildings and developments will hopefully become good selling features if they are, if consumers become aware of what they represent, and the fact that those certified buildings have benefits for them in the long run, so that there's a distinction between a quality development and a lower quality development. Now, how do you get all of that happening? You need some government policies to help drive that. There are, again, a wide range because countries have been increasingly implementing mitigation policies. We have more and more knowledge about what policies work and how to design them so that they are effective, and whether they can be used in developing countries or developed countries, and how to adjust them. So there is practical experience here. Some of the things we've learned are that typically mitigation policies are implemented in packages and that are tailored for different sectors so that you can regulate some sectors and have carbon taxes or trading systems for other sectors, or have overlapping regulations and carbon taxes. One of the things to consider if you're in the government, that as all of these electric vehicles come in, you will find that the revenue you collect from gas taxes, gasoline taxes, starts to drop. No more gasoline vehicles, and that's going to start happening within a few years because those vehicles are starting to come in. So one of the options you might want to consider are mitigation policies that raise some revenue so that you have a new stream of revenue to offset the diminishing stream of gasoline taxes. And those options, the most common options for generating revenue, are carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. And if you start them low enough, you don't have to raise huge amounts of money and cause significant price impacts that are problematic for the adjustments. So the government is going to be faced with an adjustment problem, and they can use that requirement to generate more revenue to also benefit the environment and replenish their revenue supplies. So there are useful options available for the government. To keep us on time, I hope, a review. Basically, to meet the global climate change goal, we need to get to net zero by 2050. And that means everybody has to get to net zero, even if your contribution is very small and you're poor. Everybody has to get there one way or the other. And there will be some help for countries, but it won't be as much as you expect. And there will be developments that are led by developed countries that will affect you, and hopefully they all benefit you, but that is not guaranteed. And you have to do some things on your own because the power generating stations, the buildings will be here. They're not going to come from somewhere else. The cars will come from somewhere else. The industry technology will come from somewhere else. But there are some things that have to be the result of Philippine initiative. You can delay things like agriculture and the industrial adjustments, industrial technology adjustments, but focus on the things you can focus on. And the government, I think, will also have to implement some policies to help drive that, and they can do that in a way that helps solve their problem with declining gas revenues and at the same time benefit the environment. So thank you very much. I hope that gives you some food for thought.